Hi. Can you hear us now, yeah? Brilliant. Okay. Hi, everyone. I know many people are still rushing from the very overrun workshops from previously, and welcome those of you who are here. I expect a few more people will be coming in during the course of the session, but we want to get going because after this session, we go on to the final plenary where we also do the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize Awards. And it's quite appropriate, really, because Emma Humphreys was one of the women that we campaigned around, and her story fits very well with the stories that we're going to tell you now. I'd like to introduce myself and my two fellow activist campaigners. So I'm Harriet Wistrich, and this is Pragna Patel from Southall Black Sisters, and Julie Bindel, who is speaking in her capacity as a Justice for Women campaigner. And I'm going to just give a little bit of a brief introduction to how we came to, how we all came together originally. And then I want to give you a bit of an overview of a really important piece of research we undertook, which is the one that's on the slideshow. And I've got a couple of booklets here, but it's also online on the Centre for Women's Justice website and the Justice for Women website. But just by way of brief background, I expect quite a few of you may have been around back in the early 1990s when we started campaigning around the issue of women who kill, women who are in violence and abusive relationships, who are driven to kill the partners who abuse them, and how they are then treated by the criminal justice system. The campaigns came together. First of all, we were involved in the Sara Thornton campaign, Sara Thornton, who killed her husband, and started campaigning outside the court when her appeal was being heard. And in the meantime, Southall Black Sisters were campaigning around the case of Kiranjit, Ahluwalia, who also killed her violent husband. In both cases, they were convicted of murder and sentenced to a life imprisonment. Both were appealing their conviction on the basis that the abuse they had suffered was provocation, and they should have succeeded with the lower offence of manslaughter. We worked together, the two campaigns. Justice for Women was formed, and Southall Black Sisters, together with Justice for Women, sought to highlight that issue. And over the following few years, we had a number of successes with the successful appeal of Kiranjit Ahluwalia in 1992, and then the appeal of Emma Humphreys in 1995, and then the second appeal of Sara Thornton in 96. And we felt that the courts were beginning to understand that when women are in abusive relationships and they act and take someone's life, it is because they were trying to survive. And they did it out of absolutely no other motive or reason than to survive the abuse. And yet the courts treated them as murderers and often convicted them in circumstances where a man who, for instance, kicked his wife to death, and a judge recognised that he was being nagged by his wife, was successfully pleading provocation and got a 2-year sentence. So the gross injustice in those sentences, which we sought to highlight. However, despite the huge successes of those early campaigns, we continued to see some women being convicted of murder in similar circumstances, and sadly that continues to today. So in about 2016, we were offered the opportunity by a very generous donation from a very decent guy who said, what can you do if I give you some money? And so we decided that the most useful thing was to undertake some proper research so that we could really look at the situation of what led women to kill and how they were treated in the criminal justice system, so that we could use that research to influence all the different criminal justice agencies and wider public opinion to try and create change. Because we campaigned for a change in the law, and there had been a change in the law in 2009 when the defence of provocation was changed to a loss of control. But it didn't appear that that has made much of a difference. So what we felt we had to do was go down deeper to look at what really, to understand what leads women to be treated so unjustly by the criminal justice system. And also because it's not just about women who kill. There are very few women who kill each year. But we're looking at also the wider lessons for the criminal justice system. And this is what this research shows us, and how we are trying to take that forward, which I'll mention a little bit further towards the end. So I'm just going to go through a few slides just to try and summarize the research. It is a long piece of research, and it is on our website, but so you can read in more detail, but this is a summary. First of all, just so that you can see how we conducted the research, we did interviews with 20 women in prison, women who were all mostly serving life sentences, or one or two who had appealed, and did lengthy interviews with them. We got permission from the prison system. This is the only piece of research we're aware of where there are those in-depth interviews with women who have been convicted of offences relating to having killed their abuser. We also interviewed a number of legal practitioners to get their perspective, and we interviewed some journalists. We also did some interviews with academic experts. And then we also did a very in-depth study of secondary data, including a review of domestic homicide reports. These are after any homicide where it's suspected that there was a relationship, there should be a domestic homicide review, and they proved to be a very useful source of information. We also had access to the Criminal Cases Review Commission case files, and were able to review 17 cases that we identified that fitted with the... so these are cases basically where somebody has tried to appeal their conviction unsuccessfully and is now putting forward more evidence and wants an opportunity to appeal. But very rarely are those cases actually referred back to the Court of Appeal. We also had Freedom of Information Act data from police forces and the Home Office, and we undertook a review of 119 media reports. So these were some of the key outcomes, and unsurprisingly, many more women are killed by male partners, about an 8-to-1 ratio, than women are killed by men. Those are the figures: 108 men killed. This is over a 10-year period, from 2008 to 2018, 835 women killed by male partners. And then we were able to look at underlying trends of what information was available in all those cases as to how many of those that killed men were in an abusive relationship. And again, we compared that with the evidence to suggest abuse from the deceased. So that's the evidence that existed, and of course we know that some women never ever disclose abuse. The other piece of information that we know from the campaigning we've undertaken is that women who kill are very rarely acquitted. So even if they kill in what would seem to be self-defense, they're very rarely acquitted. In fact, of the 108 cases, 42 women were convicted of manslaughter, that's 46%. 40 were convicted of murder, and only 7% of cases where women were actually acquitted on grounds of self-defense. So to be acquitted, you have to successfully use self-defense. Manslaughter is a partial defense, which could include loss of control or diminished responsibility. And many of the women, even though they were all victims of abuse, were still convicted of murder. We then drill down into those cases further. The other really interesting statistic is in relation to the use of weapons. So in 71% of the cases, women had used a knife, and in 9% of the cases, women attacked the deceased with another weapon. So unsurprisingly, if a woman kills her violent male partner, she uses a weapon. We know from the femicide census, when you do a comparison, that the second most common form of killing is through strangulation by men of their partners. There are no cases in which a woman has strangled her male partner, which is unsurprising. But it tells us a lot. But what is really relevant is that in sentencing, if you're sentenced for murder, it's seen as an aggravating feature if you use a weapon or a knife. So often sentences are longer because a weapon is used. So that's without obviously looking at the underlying differences, not just in physical strength, but in the ability to use your bare hands to kill somebody, which obviously is something that men do quite frequently and women don't do. It's not moving. Hello? Oh, there we go. So when we looked at the domestic homicide reviews and the other data, we found in many cases there was a history of abuse, and the domestic homicide data in particular told us that these are domestic homicide reviews, that so many of the cases women had been failed repeatedly by the police and by the criminal justice system from getting protection. So it's not simply that they were victims and they didn't disclose. Even when they did disclose, they were not given the protection of the police. Again, if you compare this to the femicide census and the data from that census, you will see that in many of those cases where women are killed, they are failed repeatedly by the police. So when there's a call out about domestic abuse, whether they call out or whether a neighbour calls out, the police fail to intervene. It's exactly the same picture, but it ends up the other way around. So the women are frequently failed, and then, unsurprisingly, this is why we criminalise women who we might otherwise be burying. Unsurprisingly, there comes a point where either the woman is killed or she survives by taking the life of their abuser. And that is very common. And of course, with that goes underreporting as well. And then the research, I'm not going to go into too much detail, suggest you read the report if you're interested, but we then kind of, with the research, looked through the whole criminal justice process. So we looked first at what happens when women are arrested and what happens when they're represented in the police station, and then subsequently. And of course, in many cases, I think Pragna will talk about this a bit further, when a woman's arrested, many of the cases we work with, when a woman is arrested, it's the first time she's ever been arrested. Sometimes it's the first time she's ever been in a police station. I remember Diana Butler, who was a woman that we worked with in an appeal, she said she didn't even know that you could call the police about domestic abuse. The first time she found out was when she was in a police station and saw a poster up saying, call the police if you're a victim of domestic abuse. Often families arrange for you to be legally represented, and they arrange often very inappropriate representatives who don't understand domestic abuse, and that's where things start to go wrong. And prosecutors seem to regard these cases as ones where it is necessary to pursue murder charges come what may, regardless of the surrounding circumstances and the evidence that may be available. We then looked into the whole court process. One of the issues which I mentioned earlier is that often lawyers really do not understand about violence against women. Of course, the majority of violent crimes are committed by men, often men towards women, and the lack of understanding about women being able to disclose abuse is often a real issue. And of course, if you don't have that understanding, the chance of being able to build trust and facilitate disclosure is often undermined. And there are difficulties about arguing self-defense, as we mentioned previously. Self-defense rarely seems to work in these cases. So those are some of the issues that we go through, and then look at the whole issue about evidence in the courtroom and being able to use expert evidence, which is very difficult because the courts only seem to really recognise psychiatrists as experts, and they don't recognise the expertise of those who work day in and day out, as well as survivors themselves who can describe abuse. Some of the particular challenges that we found in the courtroom setting, and also with women, many of the women, certainly the women I've worked with, and I'm sure Pragna as well, is that the actual act of the killing can be so deeply traumatizing that sometimes there's a dissociative moment, or sometimes they've just sort of blanked out the memory of exactly what happened. But when people say, well, what happened? They can't just say, I don't remember. They feel they can't say, I just can't remember. So they sometimes make things up, and they say, well, somebody, I don't know, they make up all sorts of stories. But once you've made up a story, even in a moment of emergency, you're stuck with that story, and that story then becomes a lie, and that lie then comes to be a huge thing in the trial, and it's often a thing that is made a huge thing of by the prosecution and can lead to criminal conviction. So women are being convicted of murder, not because they intended to kill somebody, but because they told a lie at some stage, often at the beginning of the process. And there's often, so many times we've heard judges and lawyers, even lawyers for the defense, saying, well, it was 6 of one, half dozen of another. She gave as good as she got. There was violence on both sides. So a complete lack of actually trying to unravel what that was about, and about if a woman hits out, where she is hitting out from. Of course, there's often, when women are in violent and abusive relationships, they will use drink and drugs to try and mask the pain. And so substance misuse is often a problem, but it's not something you can build into your defense if it's seen as an aggravating feature. And then the courts fail to understand some very basic concepts which are very critical. There's an absence of an explanation of myths and stereotypes that surround abusive relationships. So, for example, a common question that is asked where a woman has killed a violent partner is, well, why didn't she leave if she was unhappy in the relationship? So there's a lack of understanding of, again, something we learn from looking at women who are killed in the femicide census, that perhaps the most dangerous point in a really abusive relationship, in one that's building up in coercive and controlling behaviour, is the point at which a woman decides that she's going to leave the partner. That is often the most risky, recognised now as the most risky period, but it's not something that is understood in these sorts of cases. I won't go into the detail about the expert evidence, I've mentioned that previously, but it's very difficult to put forward really helpful expert evidence, and if psychiatrists are the only experts that are really recognised, while there are a few good psychiatrists that understand trauma, many are ill-educated about the impact of abuse, and they're not the appropriate experts. And then we looked what happens if, in circumstances where somebody is convicted. We looked at sentencing. I've mentioned earlier about how the use of a weapon is seen as an aggravating circumstance, even though that is the only resource that women sometimes have to defend themselves. When we look at and break down the sentences, women are being given longer and longer sentences. It's partly because sentencing is increasing. It's increasing also for men. But some of the sentences we see, whether they are really, really long sentences for manslaughter, 18 years, 14 to 18 years is not unusual. Really, really long sentences, women being separated from their kids often. And if they are convicted of murder, you get a minimum tariff, and those tariffs are going up and up and up. So sentencing for these women is going up on the back of sentencing just generally increasing. Appeals are very, very difficult. You can only appeal a criminal conviction if you can show that there was a legal error in the judge's summing up, or if you can put forward fresh evidence. And fresh evidence is very difficult. Usually the only way in which we can find grounds of appeal is through psychiatric evidence. In the Sally Challen appeal, we were able to formulate an argument that at the time she was convicted, it was before there was an understanding of coercive and controlling behaviour, and it was only because a law was passed and there became greater understanding. We say if that understanding had existed at the time of her trial, then her lawyers could have put forward that framework to show how the relationship was abusive. And if we'd been able to do that at the time, then she may not have been convicted of murder. So that afforded her a ground of appeal. And we also see that women who are coming to the end of their life sentences have to go through the parole system, but the parole system is really, really not alive to issues of who presents a risk. And women are often not getting parole because they haven't been given the support they need in prison. They're not actually a risk to anyone other than themselves. But often you see women remaining in prison, women who are very damaged, remaining in prison for longer than their minimum tariff because the parole system doesn't, and because the prison system is so geared around the male experience. We make a whole series of recommendations, and what we're trying to do through the Centre for Women's Justice now, we've got a new project which looks more broadly at the criminalisation of women who are victims of abuse. So we're looking not just at the small number of women who kill, but also at women who are convicted of other offences. And any of you who have been through domestic abuse yourselves, or who work with domestic abuse victims, will know that often when police are called to an incident, they will arrest the woman because the man appears really calm and she's really distressed, and then he says she was violent to me, and the police arrest the wrong person. And sometimes that ends up with her also being prosecuted. And we also know that in many cases women are being are committing offences because they are under abuse and coercive control from their violent partners or from their coercive and controlling partners. And there is no defence available if you commit offence under duress. There is supposedly a defence of duress, but it is not available, as far as I know, to anyone who commits an offence in those circumstances. So we're also doing work around that, and we are rolling out this research report to all the different criminal justice agencies, from the police, the Crown Prosecution Service. We hope to do judges and police and crime commissioners we've spoken to, and we're trying to get, just really try and translate the understanding that we've gained through this research and through the work we've done, so that there can be change. But I can tell you it's not easy. And we did a presentation to a whole load of CPS prosecutors. It was on Zoom, and not a single one made a single question, asked a single comment or question. So I'm not quite sure. I wish we could just soothe a lot of them, but it's not always easy. I'm going to hand over now to my sister and comrade, Pragna Patel, who has written an appendix to this research, looking specifically at the experience of BME women, and she's going to talk a bit about that and other lessons, I think.
Thank you. Thank you so much. It's always a pleasure to be on a panel with Julie and Harriet. We go back such a long way. And between us, there's probably lots of things to remember and to reflect on. I think I want to start by talking about the fact that if our feminist history has taught us anything, is not to take anything for granted. Least of all because the gains that we have made are increasingly under threat in all directions. And when I was thinking about what to say, the first thing that struck me is how strange it is in 2021 to be talking about the abject failure of the criminal justice system to respond to violence against women, 2 decades after the cases of Sara Thornton, Kiranjit Ahluwalia, and Emma Humphreys. And sometimes it feels like a never-ending burden, you know, having to constantly campaign for better protection and better laws, to end violence against women and girls, and to improve state accountability in the context of persistent patriarchy, racism, inequality, and injustice. And even though we've come so far, it also sometimes feels as if we've stood still and even gone backwards. And so today, what I thought I would do is reflect on the campaigns that we waged in the 90s that Harriet's talked about around Women Who Kill, and what they've taught us, and what more needs to be done to improve women's access to justice. I think the first thing I want to talk about is the fact that in all our years in relation to our work, the law is a really important and critical site, both for the assertion of the human rights, particularly of Black and minority women. Indeed, for many BME women, it is the final safety net, because most live in contexts where they're subject to internal sources of control and power that competes with the state as to who has ultimate authority and privilege over women's lives. Indeed, one of the key dilemmas affecting Black and minority women today is using the law when the law itself is a contested space. And some of our most important legal challenges have involved both using and challenging the law in order to advance the cause of women's rights. So we've challenged the law's assumed gender, race, and class neutrality, which both masks and reproduces inequality, exclusion, and marginalization. And more importantly, we've challenged the law to examine underlying structures of power and the complex role of culture and religion that may have a bearing on minority women's experiences of domestic abuse and their response to it, even when an intersectional race and gender approach is applied in law and policy. So, for example, as Harriet has talked about, in the late 80s and throughout the 90s, we campaigned, South All Black Sisters in particular campaigned on the case of Kiranjit Ahluwalia, an Asian woman who killed her husband after experiencing 10 years of abuse at his hands. She was found guilty and convicted for murder, without the court having considered her experiences of abuse within her specific cultural context. And some of us were highly troubled by this conviction. Many of us had watched a US documentary film that had happened to come on telly around the same time, which was about the experiences of American women who killed their abusive husbands and the way in which the criminal justice system over there responded. And the documentary film was entitled, "I Killed My Husband and No One Asked Why." And the film stayed with us. And when we were confronted with Kiranjit's case, we realized that issues of male bias and discrimination in homicide laws in the US were also very pertinent to us in the UK. And from the start of our engagement with the criminal justice system, what we saw was that neither the police nor the courts were concerned with the abuse and violence that Kiranjit faced. And throughout her interviews with the police and in court, she was made to focus only on the immediate events surrounding the killing, despite her repeated attempts to explain her actions and history of abuse and the impact that the abuse had on her. Following her conviction of murder and the consequent life sentence that she received, we set about appealing her conviction, and in the process found ourselves also seeking to reform the homicide laws of provocation and self-defense. We set about trying to explain why Kiranjit killed her husband and why she could not leave. The case involved a challenge to the then law of provocation in particular, because it was, amongst other things, based on the need to demonstrate an immediate act of retaliation to an incident of provocation, loss of self-control, a defense which was constructed around male-on-male violence. And it didn't allow for an examination of the context in which women kill as a result of long histories of abuse and fear, despair, and trauma. And the laws did not allow for an examination of the very real social, cultural, economic, and emotional barriers that can prevent exit from abuse. But our work on that case also sought to highlight how misunderstandings on culture and race can also intersect with institutionalized sexism in the legal system, creating wider injustice for Black and minority women in particular. For example, in summing up her case, the trial judge in Kiranjit's original criminal trial told the jury that the only characteristics which they needed specifically to know that might be relevant to their deliberations was that she was an Asian woman, married, in his words, incidentally to an Asian man. You may think she is an educated woman. She has a university degree. That's what the judge summed up. It is not too difficult to see that in the judge's mind, her cultural background was, in his words, incidental. And her actions and the fact that she was educated cancelled out the impact of the very real cultural and religious constraints on her life. And it actually, as I was writing this and thinking about this, I thought how it stood in stark contrast to Kiranjit's own speech that she gave from prison at the launch of her campaign in Crawley, Sussex, which is where she had originally come from. And in what remains one of the most powerful indictments of religion and culture that I have seen described by a survivor, she said the following: "My culture is like my blood, coursing through every vein of my body. It is the culture into which I was born and where I grew up, which sees the women as the honor of the house. In order to uphold this false honor and glory, she is taught to endure many kinds of oppression and pain in silence. In addition, religion also teaches her that her husband is her God, and fulfilling his every desire is her religious duty. A woman who does not follow this path in our society has no respect or place in it. She suffers from all kinds of attacks and much hurt entirely alone. She is responsible not only for her husband, but also his entire family's happiness. No one asked why all this had happened. Why did everyone use me as they chose? Though I was the mother of 2 children, I couldn't take any decision on my own. I could not even name my children as I chose. This is the essence of my culture, society, religion, where a woman is a toy, a plaything. She can be stuck together at will, broken at will. So you can see that stark contrast between the judge's clinical summing up of her circumstances and her own understanding and reality. And it is precisely this reality of dual oppression engendered by patriarchal violence and by state processes that led Kiranjit to say that when she was jailed for life, that she had come out of the jail of her husband and entered the jail of the law. We eventually succeeded in assisting Kiranjit to overturn her conviction for murder, which was eventually substituted for manslaughter at her second criminal trial. She was sentenced to 3 years and 4 months in prison, which is exactly the same time that she had served in prison. And so at her second trial, she walked out a free woman. When we embarked on the case, we realized very, very early on that we also needed to conduct a political campaign, mainly due to the fact that we understood the limits of the law as a sole site of protest. And we knew that we had to embark on the campaign if we were to reopen her case. We knew that we needed to raise awareness and bring public pressure to bear on the courts if we were to stand a chance of overturning her conviction. But we had no idea that the case, along with the contemporaneous cases of Sara Thornton and Amelia Rossiter, and then later Emma Humphreys, would capture the public imagination and become the rallying point for feminist activism. They really seemed to galvanize the feminist movement, not just around the question of gender bias in criminal laws, but around the issue of domestic abuse generally in ways that were unprecedented. The campaigns around these women were crucial in building solidarity between women across all sorts of divides, even though we sometimes disagreed on the nature of law reform that was needed. Kiranjit's cases and that of others eventually changed the law of provocation, and other abused women were able to use the defense of provocation in contexts where they're subject to prolonged violence and abuse. And we succeeded in limiting its use by jealous and violent men who seek to excuse their behavior. But I do believe that as a result of these high-profile cases, we started to also see a normative shift in public perceptions of domestic abuse. Certainly in Asian communities, what was once a taboo subject was now out in the open, and there was even considerable support for Kiranjit amongst men. Even as far afield as India, the case made headlines and there followed a Bollywood movie, the merits of which I will not discuss. Suffice to say that it is used as a vital educational tool by community groups and university law departments in that country to raise awareness about the law as a site of patriarchal class and caste power, despite its illusions of egalitarianism. Given the very critical period that women in India have now reached in respect of resisting violence, abuse, and rape, I'm particularly proud of what the Kiranjit case achieved. And I also have to say that the lively and colourful protests that we mounted outside the Court of Appeal during the campaign for justice for Kiranjit were some of the best moments of my political activism. They were protests that involved black and white feminists, young and old, professionals and survivors, all coming together in a show of feminist strength and power. They really hinted at the possibility of what can be achieved when we come together, despite our different feminist traditions and political standpoints and perspectives. So what are the challenges that we face now? Although we've achieved much in the field of violence against women and girls, especially around the issue of women who kill, sadly, as Harriet's shown, we also face many of the same problems as before, perhaps even in more heightened forms. The key contradiction, as I see it, is that despite what we have achieved, women continue to be denied a voice, misunderstood, and discriminated in the criminal justice system, despite growing awareness of concepts such as coercive control. The Center for Women's Justice Research highlights many of the continuing barriers that battered women who kill face in the criminal justice system. And as Harriet's pointed out in the appendix to the research, I've set out in some details some recurring problems faced by Black and minority women who kill their abusive partners. For example, one of the recurring problems is the lack of documented and contemporaneous evidence of abuse, which continues to hinder women's access to justice in the courts, even though such lack of evidence is not surprising. For example, many South Asian women are socialized into internalizing abuse, and so find it extremely painful and shameful to talk of their experiences of abuse publicly. Most feel constrained in admitting that they have faced abuse and violence, mainly because such public disclosure carries family and community censure and backlash that can have serious consequences for them and any children involved, and can also impact on their own natal families. For African and Caribbean women, the lack of evidence may arise from the fear of being over-policed. For example, arrested and detained if they report abuse. Despite evidence that suggests that women from African and Caribbean backgrounds face high levels of domestic abuse, their accounts of abuse or coercion and control are often deemed to be incapable of belief. Any act of retaliation to abuse on their part is often treated as an act of aggression, and as a consequence, many are treated as perpetrators of abuse and so disproportionately criminalized. Another problem is the creation of cultural standards or thresholds by which women are judged within the criminal justice system. I've already alluded to this when talking about the Kiranjit Ahluwalia case. And although in many cases expert evidence may be critical in understanding cultural and religious contexts, it is often treated by judges and others in the system with considerable skepticism, and what is presented is often turned on its head and used against women. There is a tendency, for example, to reduce dynamic and fluid cultural contexts to stereotypical understandings and assumptions that lead to the creation of cultural standards by which women's actions are assessed. For example, concepts such as shame and dishonor are used to create a paradigm of absolute South Asian female passivity that is then used to reject women's behaviors that do not completely conform to such standards. If women have acted in ways that suggest an element of agency or found ways to survive within the constraints of their relationships and environments, they are deemed not to be under the influence of culture or religion or impacted by such constraints. If they lead so-called westernized or independent lives, they're deemed to fall outside the cultural threshold that is created. Another example that I can give is the prevalence of the myth of African and Caribbean women as fulfilling masculine roles in their communities. Notions of such women as strong, aggressive, or independent and self-reliant often work to the disadvantage of such women when they find themselves subject to abuse, because they are often viewed as the principal aggressors, and they are addressed as such. Other problems in the criminal justice system include the failure to disclose abuse from the beginning, the lack of access to proper specialized legal representation and proper interpreters who are gender sensitized when taking instructions from BME women, or the lack of choice in women's ability to choose their own legal representation. And as Harriet said right at the start, many are chosen by their families who in turn rely on community networks. And women's overall lack of knowledge and awareness of their rights in the legal system also become barriers. So in conclusion, despite the gains that we have made, the struggle to access justice, I think, has reached a critical point. The ever-widening shadow of neoliberalism and the rise of religious fundamentalism and conservatism has left us struggling on two interlinked fronts. First, we are compelled to challenge the state for removing legal aid from a huge range of civil and criminal matters, for outsourcing justice to private and religious arbitration forums, and for threatening to limit access to tools that we need, such as judicial review and the Human Rights Act, which not only impact on individual rights, but also on our demands for institutional accountability in the face of abuses of power that seem to be growing rather than diminishing. These developments should also be located within a wider international context. Around the world, many countries, including the UK, are taking an increasingly inward-looking and nationalist approach, distancing themselves from international human rights norms and standards. We're witnessing an unprecedented onslaught on citizenship rights and human rights laws based on a rejection of secular democratic values that were established after the aftermath of the Second World War, not just by those in the West, but also by those who struggled against colonialism and imperialism around the world. All of this has highlighted the urgent need to develop a politics of solidarity between feminists, which recognizes that what is at stake is no less than the fight for secular, progressive, feminist, and anti-racist values. Our struggle for self-determination may be supported by the law from time to time, but the larger struggle can only be won through more united campaigns for justice and human rights. Thank you, I'll stop there.
Pragna, it's always an honour to be on a panel with you, and I learn something from you every time. Since the late 80s, I've just outed us as old, right? Since we've been working together, you have been such an inspiration, and you are one of the women that I would never mess with. Absolutely. So I'm just going to speak briefly about the media coverage of these cases, because I think that many of you are well aware of how sexism in the media isn't a cause or a consequence of what happens to women who kill, or the reporting of men who kill women and get away with it, but rather it's a kind of circular effect. So the level of misogyny and sexism in society is often reflected within media reporting, which then is fed back to the judiciary, fed back to juries, because we know that jurors do read newspaper reports of cases in which they're involved. And even more abstractly than that jurors, potential jurors, future jurors, will be reading newspaper reports of such cases, and they take that, as we take all of our prejudices into a trial where women are in the situation that Pragna and Harriet have described. And of course we have a broader view, as both Harriet and Pragna have said, about focusing on the issues of women who kill, because there are few women who go to such extremes to defend themselves or to respond to domestic violence and abuse. But they exist within a context of male violence, domestic violence and abuse. And the far bigger problem, I mean, in terms of numbers and consequences for women, is of course men killing women and men getting away with murder, which of course sends a message so deeply damaging that it has an effect on our safety and on men's impunity. And I became a journalist as a response to some of the really bad reporting on these cases. And also because I was really inspired by some of the good reporting. One, ironically, I think one of our greatest friends in the media around the time of Kiranjit's case, Sara Thornton's case, and all of the other big high-profile cases, including Emma Humphreys was Duncan Campbell, crime reporter at The Guardian, who really got it. But he didn't just wake up one day and understand violence against women, did he? I mean, he actually has been in a relationship with Julie Christie for decades, and I think that she possibly educated him a little bit. But I'd like to think that we, the feminists that engaged with him, this was when they used to send reporters to cover cases when newspapers weren't on such tight budgets. And he would see the demonstrations, he'd see that members of the public were walking past and taking the literature, from SBS, from Justice for Women. And he actually became really engaged with how this issue, with the dynamics of this issue within crime reporting. And I think that had a really big knock-on effect, because there were other female journalists. Heather Mills comes to mind, who wrote for The Independent. She also wrote for some of the Sundays. And then there was, and also Jennifer Nadel, who was a TV anchor, whatever we call that, hello, Jennifer Nadel, News at 10, outside the High Court, one of those. And she actually got really engaged with the issue, wrote a book mainly based on Sara Thornton's case, but also bringing in the cases of the other women. And so this is how good media reporting works, isn't it? And I think one of the worst things I ever saw, which is different from some of the terrible reports, which I'll briefly mention, on women who kill, and of course on men who kill women for no good reason whatsoever, as if there could be a good reason, was when Emma Humphreys died in 1998. And you'll know Emma's case, of course, and so I'm not going to go into detail. But the front page of the Nottingham Evening Post had the headline, "Killer Tart Found Dead in Bed." And this was just unbelievably painful and staggering, and made us so very, very angry. And as a journalist, obviously, I'm minded to look at headlines, which we don't write. And we don't write headlines, but we can ask to see our headlines. And also we can make sure that our copy does not actually give a sub-editor an opportunity to create such a terrible headline. And also, of course, there's the little talked about issue of what journalists call the furniture, so the photographs and the pull quotes. And prostitution is a case in point here, of course, where you have a report on murders of prostituted women with the usual photograph of a pixelated man in a car and a woman bending over, looking through the window in fishnet tights and a short skirt. And high heels, of course. And so, in general, we know that sexist, sometimes even misogynistic reporting, has a terrible effect in all aspects of society. But focusing on women who kill, what we found when looking at comparisons between reports of women in the dock and men in the dock was that the specificity of the women's characters and lifestyles were very often highlighted. So her ethnicity was always specific, but not in the way that Pragna outlined is actually appropriate and helpful to understanding circumstances. Class was often very, very kind of covertly referred to. And there's something, I think, in the way that the case of Jane Andrews was reported. Do you know who Jane Andrews is? She was described in the press as Fergie's dresser.
Fergie's killer dresser.
Fergie's killer dresser. I suppose there was a time she was just Fergie's dresser. But anyway, she was basically a servant for the royal family. And the poor thing worked with Sarah Ferguson and your child abusing, what's his name? Trafficking, Andrew. And she killed her, this was in the 90s, she killed her extremely sexually and physically violent partner, Tom Cressman, and she was on trial for being a working class girl from Grimsby who was no better than she ought to be, but she was also on trial for having the neck to be part of the Royals. And she was doomed from the beginning. And I think that the media led her case. I think it led it, it fueled it, and I think it concluded it. I really do. I think there's no better example of trial by media than Jane Andrews. And you should look up her case if you're not familiar with it. She lost her appeal. She served a full life sentence and tragically was actually recalled to prison for a situation that began with her being targeted as a vulnerable woman by yet another tosspot. And she would not have been recalled to prison had she not been vilified by the mainly tabloid media, but across the board. And I think other things to kind of point out in terms of the comparison is that whilst the women are described as whether problematic drinkers or drug users, whether they're working class, or in the case of Fry Martin, black and from Liverpool, which was written in a way that just spoke scum. It's hard to understand the impact that would have, because she's spoken about it herself on that jury. But if you read any report about Fry Martin, you'll see exactly what the subtext was. And she'd killed a black man of dual heritage. And it was almost seen as a kind of scum on scum killing, but that she was still banged to rights. She was worse than he was, despite the evidence of the violence. One big thread running through the reporting of women who kill, and this was certainly the case in Kiranjit, the media coverage, was jealousy, wasn't it? The kind of jealous wife. If I can't have him, nobody else can. And I mean, look, these men are beating up and raping women with impunity. Of course they're going to be shagging around. I mean, of course they're going to be having affairs. And that, his additional appalling behaviour, possibly that he tortured her with, was then used as her motive. So the motives are ascribed to women that actually are the real motives of men who kill and get away with it. Because the women have no motives that we represent and work with. These women are scared for their lives. There is no motive. She doesn't sit there and plan it. She does this because she thinks she's going to die. And yet, it's twisted to the point of where this is seen as a reason for her to take such drastic action. What woman does anyone in this room know who really, really would take such action when he's just a sweet, gentle man, but he has an affair? I'm going to kill him. That's what men do to women. But newspaper reporting would have us thinking it was the other way around. And of course women, and we know this of old, are seen as absolute monsters for committing what the press will have you believe is an act of violence in terms of an act, or rather than an act of self-defense, and quite a kind of sane and rational action when it's her or him. When men kill, often we only hear about them being good husbands and fathers, and they get a character reference always from one of the neighbours or a workmate. But he was such a good dad. He was very gentle. He mowed my lawn for me once. But the woman who kills gets no such character reference. In fact, she was often seen around in her slippers looking a bit mad. And this, it's so obvious to, I'm sure, all of us in the room about how this works. But it was an interesting exercise just to drill down a little bit and see how it works so blatantly. I have to say, I know we should never laugh at this kind of thing, but there was one case of a woman who killed, as it turned out, her violent partner, so we can have a bit of a laugh, that my friend and colleague Sandra McNeil alerted me to, right back in the 1980s. Drunken, violent man used to come in on a Friday night, 13 pints of cider, whatever, start kicking off, and she would, in order to deter him from coming any closer, sling a knife at him, knowing he would dodge. He always dodged. The knife would go, he'd duck. The headline in the Yorkshire Evening Post was, "He dodged the wrong way." And this was in quotes. And this was the woman who'd been arrested. And she says, well, he always dodged, and this time. Anyway, I can't remember what happened with the case, but it was the only time that I actually laughed at a headline like that. I think there might have been another one. The dog did it was a good one, which relates to the very serious point about women not being able to remember these traumatic events and say anything that they can think of when the police arrest them. And just to conclude, I think what runs through the reports that we analysed of women and men who kill is the lack of appropriate language to describe domestic violence and abuse. So they will go hammer and tong to say that the men who kill women who were nagging, we call it the nagging and shagging defence, so who were nagging him or who had been unfaithful with his best friend and therefore humiliated him. The way that this is reported is kind of very serious trauma for him. The way that violence is often reported, that the women have endured that leads them to kill, is so inappropriately framed that you can quite easily come away with, again, the idea that she could just have left and that she wasn't in a hostage situation and this wasn't something that had terrorised her into committing such an extreme act. Thank you.
Thanks. Thanks very much, Julie and Pragna. And I don't know if anyone has any questions or comments from below. There's lots more we could go wang on about for ages. I'd just comment that, you know, the three of us, as you can see, are really old hags. And something has kept us going since the early 90s, and that experience of campaigning together on these cases, as Pragna said, it's probably the most important campaigns I've ever been involved with. And I think it is what we've learned from that and the inspiration that we got from that as one of the things that's fired us all to continue in our own campaigning, but also in the work that we do. I ended up going into the law. Julie ended up becoming a journalist.
I carried on. Carried on.
Even you gave in and become a lawyer, didn't you?
Then I realised political activism was more relevant.
But I think what it tells us about what can make a successful approach, really, and it's something that I've tried to sort of incorporate into the Centre for Women's Justice, which was formed more recently, is the idea of that sort of circle of expertise, the importance, you know, there isn't a chicken or an egg in a sense. There is misogyny in society, and that's what we campaign around, but there's also the importance of hearing the expertise of survivors and really listening to that and working with survivors. And it's also about using the law in creative ways and using the media and working with the media where you can to recreate narratives so that we can change things. And the Sally Challen appeal and the campaign around that, I think, was an opportunity. It wasn't just about winning Sally's appeal, which was a pretty unwinnable appeal before, when we started the case, but it was actually about getting the idea of, really broadening the understanding in society of coercive and controlling behaviour so that women started identifying themselves as victims, friends of those women and family of those women started identifying it. And the police, there was pressure on the police and the criminal justice agencies to really start to arrest and prosecute coercive and controlling behaviour. So, although in some ways it's a depressing story that women are still being convicted, that the criminal justice system is so grotesquely discriminatory against women, it's also a very enlightening story that we can really by being activists, by taking the experiences that we learn through our activism and through our campaigning, and applying it in whatever worlds we occupy, we can make changes, we can make an impact. And the media come to us all the time now, and we use that where we can to try and get those messages across. Would anyone like to ask any questions or make any comments? Yes, there's somebody with a hand up. Do you? Oh, you've got to. Yeah.
Hi. I wanted to ask when it comes to age and the length of the relationship. So we're talking now, and you talk about Sally Challen, coercive control. We understand now that women, who perhaps have been in these relationships for such a long time, married, wives, mothers, we're starting to understand the impact of that long-term abuse and that leads to kill. When I was being abused, I was 19, and the day that I went for my abuser with the aim to kill him, luckily I didn't, but the day that I did, I would never have seen myself as a battered wife because I was 19 and I'd been with him 8 months at that time. And I wondered if you see a difference when it does come to age and length of relationships and how women are treated and believed that they have been driven to that point in such a short amount of time. Does that make sense?
I think, sorry, it was slightly difficult to hear, but I think you're saying that is there a difference between somebody being in a really long-term relationship where they're abused and...
Sorry, I didn't realise you couldn't hear me. No, I was going to say, when it happened to me, I was 19, and when I went for the guy that was abusing me and was going to kill him, luckily didn't, I never saw myself as a battered wife because I'd been with him 8 months and I was 19, so I didn't know that I was in any way being controlled in a way that would make me act that way. So with Sally Challen, coercive control, understanding that long-term impact, is there work being done that understands that that can be a very short-term journey?
I think the reality is that many women in abusive relationships, whether they last 2 months or 40 years, don't necessarily perceive themselves as being victims of abuse. And Sally Challen never perceived herself as a victim of domestic abuse until she was in prison, and she attended the Freedom Programme, even though she was in that relationship, that abusive relationship, for so long. Emma Humphreys was in a relationship for only a few months. She was only 17 when she killed her partner. Pimp partner. I don't think there is a perception... sorry, Pragna, go on.
I think that's a really interesting question, because I think that sometimes we also inadvertently might set ourselves standards that we then have to knock down because along comes an account that doesn't fit that standard ourselves. So I think that, in the early days, I think that we did emphasize women who are in long-term relationships who are subject to repeated abuse. And I don't think it was totally, we did it because, as Julie describes, we were in an incredibly hostile environment, trying to get media attention, trying to get public attention. And so, you kind of play this, you're on a tightrope all the time. You, want to talk about the realities of women's lives, but on the other hand, you also need to be mindful of how you get those messages across that might lead to a bit more sympathy, whether it's in the media or in the criminal justice system. And so, the kind of narratives that we developed around Kiranjit Ahluwalia, I remember in particular, and maybe some of the others, but was, these are women who've never committed any kind of crimes. They've never, this is the first time they've found themselves engaging in the criminal justice system. These are women with impeccable histories. These are women who've suffered abuse over a long, long period. And particularly in the courts, when you're trying to gain sympathy, that then turns into, and you must understand the psychological impact of all of this, when actually what you really want to talk about is the social and economic context in which all of this takes place and the real barriers that women have. Where do they go to live? How can they survive on meager benefits? You know, being separated, taken out of the communities in which they live. These are real socioeconomic issues that we, you know, need to confront and explain. And what ends up happening is, in order to get the sympathy of the courts, you talk about the psychological impact. And so we have brought into this whole thing the battered women syndrome, which, you know, none of us are feeling particularly comfortable about, because it medicalizes women again, rather than focuses on the socioeconomic context of women's lives. But you do it. So I think that there are times when, you know, we do have to take a step back and perhaps get better. But I can also understand why we did what we did. And Julie's right, apart from, I'd forgotten all about the wonderful Duncan Campbell and Heather Mills and Jennifer, you know, Nadel. Apart from these few journalists, you know, it was really difficult to even get media attention. I mean, I remember when Kiranjit, you know, was convicted for murder for the first time, it was Fireball Mum, you know, spread across the, you know, Killer or something, spread across the Sun or what, you know, the tabloids. So I think there is a problem. There is a problem in that sometimes we also talk about abuse and women, you know, in long-term relationships with impeccable characters and so on, rather than talk about women and their lives as they live them, you know, in all their messiness. But it is difficult. It's because we have to tread that tightrope. You end up having to work within the constraints of the media and the criminal justice system itself, and therein lies our dilemma.
Thanks.
Just briefly, I've just remembered to that quite a funny story about Hanana Siddiqui from Southall Black Sisters, who also had an input to this report. Some of us went along with Hanana to see some female Tory MP at the time that Sara Thornton had lost her appeal. And she said, look, you really shouldn't be campaigning around Sara Thornton. She's the wrong person to campaign about, because Sara was outrageously behaved. And she'd lied in court, and there were all kinds of not the perfect victim things about her. And we're kind of nodding away whilst thinking, to hell with that. And she then said, she turned to Hanana and said, and I think that the name of your organisations is very aggressive, Southall Black Sisters. I think you should change it to something like Sheltering Tree.
Yeah, the Sheltering Tree. She said you're likely to get more funds and attraction if you call yourselves the Sheltering Tree. I don't think I'd be here if we were calling ourselves the Sheltering Tree.
Are there any other questions? I can see one right at the front over there, a couple of right at the front.
And here as well. Excuse me.
Back here, sorry, yeah.
So I can't see anything, but...
Can I?
Yeah, go ahead.
It's here, it's the other side. Hey!
Yeah, got you.
Hello,
yeah.
everybody. Very quick questions, what question? About the profile of these women, in the sense of the trial, did you perceive, observe a difference from treatment, the criminalization, if it's poor women, black or not white women? Because I've been studying this same subject, reading about studies case and national reports from Brazil, Argentina, and Portugal, and it's very clear that sometimes just when they have been from upper high society or middle class, and almost when they have this social condition, they are white, they can postpone they can be absolved or postpone the trial, you know. I have a few cases that's very different treatment, the levels of criminalization of those women. I would like to know about here in UK, if it's the same or it's not, or I don't know, just about that. Thank you.
I think absolutely. I think that the law is not, it doesn't just reflect gender bias, but also race bias, class bias. And so it's probably true universally around the world that certain voices will be privileged and others won't. And as I've said in my presentation, certain stereotypes will work against women in certain ways. So Julie talked about, sort of women from poorer class backgrounds. I've talked about the ways in which stereotypes abound around Afro-Caribbean women and South Asian women and so on in the criminal justice system. But I also have to say that it also, I think that the assumptions, gendered assumptions, racial assumptions are always going to be made in law, because the law has developed in a particular way to safeguard, to maintain a particular power status quo, whether it's on race, gender, or so on. But I have also seen, for example, middle-class women who are treated as if they should be able to cope better and actually be able to fend for themselves better, and that they don't have some of the barriers that the poorer women face, and therefore, should not find themselves in the situations that they do. So what I think we've got to all be alert to is stereotypes and assumptions in all directions. And the real need to try, and this is the most difficult thing, I think, to get across, particularly in the courtroom, is the real need to look at, to listen to what the woman in front is saying about herself and about her situation, and to divest them, the court to divest itself of assumptions and actually understand that specific reality, and that there are millions of different realities, and not fall into those kind of stereotypical responses. I think that's really, really important, but it's really difficult to achieve.
Yeah, I would completely say that. I think there are additional barriers for black and minoritized women and from working class women, but there are barriers also, as Sally Challen, for example, who was from an upper middle class background, and of course the assumption there is, well, if you had money, you could have left the relationship. So it's always just really, really important to try and, hear the stories. That's the only place to start, and to find a way in which the court will accept those narratives. Is there another question? I think there was one over there.
Sorry. Thank you.
Hi. I want to just say something in praise of Southall Black Sisters. And one of the proudest things I ever did in my life when I was at Ealing Women's Unit is giving a grant to Southall Black Sisters.
Hey.
And they were standing against the whole, and which hadn't come up, whole context of the opposition between Asian men. We used to call the race unit the Asian Boys Club. And they used to say that Southall Black Sisters were coconuts because they were black outside and white inside. But that's not the only reason for praising them over the decades, but it's also because they uniquely have understood the importance of having a kind of twin-pronged attack, what Cynthia Coburn called in and against the state, using the law, and then also using the activism, which we here today are exemplifying. And one of the important ways in which they used the law was in relation to doing the court case about having the council later not having done an equality impact assessment about a later grant application. And that's very interesting because all of that is connected with the Equality Act. And it's the Equality Act which those children chalking on the pavement outside don't understand, because the Equality Act has a protected characteristic of sex. protected characteristic of sex. And the only other relevant protected characteristic on this issue is gender reassignment, when you're going through the process of gender reassignment, not gender per se. Sex is a protected characteristic. And so taking the legal action that Pragna and her sisters have done over and over to defend women is an important part of the struggle, as is what we're all doing. Thank you.
Yes.
Thank you very much. I think we have time for one more question. We're going to try and finish at 10 past, so we have a little break before we have the Emma Humphreys Memorial Prize Awards, and I hope that all of you can stay for those awards. And we will be starting those at 3:30. So one more question coming up now. Thank you.
Hi, thanks for all your work. It's wonderful and amazing. Thank you. It's a very simple question, but what's the conversation around the term domestic abuse? Is that still the most important, the most simple way of saying it? Or is there some other conversation going on about the use of that term?
Thank you for that question. It's something that I've been actually quite wound up about in recent years. Because although I understand that in the case, for example, of Sally Challen, domestic abuse had to be used rather than domestic violence, except for, later down the line, of course, her feminist lawyers discovered that there was serious sexual violence and not just, I don't mean just, and not simply coercive control that wasn't physical and sexual violence. What happens now is that domestic violence has been replaced by domestic abuse, which waters it down. So I tend to just say domestic violence anyway, because these men that are inflicting coercive control on women, point me to one that has never been violent also, and seriously, he'll be as rare as the happy hooker.
Yeah. To be honest, I have no idea how that shift came about. But what I am worried about is something far more, I think I can understand abuse encompasses something wider than just physical violence. And that's always important, because one of the things that, we haven't done enough of, and which coercive control as a concept allows us to do, is to talk about a continuum of, behaviors that create harms for women. That's emotional, financial abuse, so important, sexual and so on. So there is benefit in using the term domestic abuse, but I also agree that, one shouldn't let go of the baby. What's the phrase? The bath and the bathwater. Throw the baby out the bathwater. But I think the more important point actually is not, whether we call it domestic violence or domestic abuse, but the gendered power relations that we constantly need to expose behind this. Because the power of the feminist movement is that we have mainstreamed all of this. But the danger and the threat that exists is that it's becoming gender neutral.
Yes.
Right? And so, actually what I like to talk about as much as I can is violence against women and girls.
Male violence.
Right? Yes. And so being alert and conscious to talking about violence against women and girls is very important. And sometimes you do use domestic abuse speak when you're dealing with professionals and funding applications and all of those things that you have to do to meet the criteria. But I think that it's really, really important that we actually continue to expose the power dynamics that lie behind these terms.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with all that. I think the problem sometimes with domestic violence as a term is that women aren't perceiving, the concept of what is violent. You tend to imagine it as a physical violence and that often even excludes sexual violence, which of course is physical violence. And the coercive and controlling behaviour has proven to be a very useful way of setting it out, because it really does show the whole range of different violences. It's not actually something that's that new, although we argued it was for the purposes of Sally Challen's appeal, but we used to have the power and control wheel as a concept, those who were working in this field, and you would look at the whole range of different forms of violence and control in a relationship. Domestic abuse, obviously you now have the Domestic Abuse Act, but the definition in the Act is not bad, I don't think. So
It's not bad, it could be explicitly gendered.
It should be gendered, and we're using the term gender here by its real meaning now, which is about the use of masculinized and feminized terms, not about gender identity or anything like that. So trying to reclaim the usefulness of that word as well. I think really we should try and draw to a halt. Thank you very much for everyone's interest.